before Europe feared his name, before kings formed alliances to destroy him, and before millions of soldiers marched under his eagle banners, Napoleon Bonaparte was only a boy from Corsica. He was not born in Paris. He was not born into a royal palace. He was not expected to rule the world, but inside him lived a hunger greater than his body, greater than his rank, greater than the island that raised him. As a young officer, he watched France burn in revolution. Kings were falling, nobles were fleeing, old laws were breaking. In that chaos, Napoleon saw something others missed. He saw a door, and once he stepped through it, Europe would never be the same again. France was no longer a quiet kingdom. The revolution had torn the country open. The monarchy had fallen. Europe's royal families watched in horror, afraid the fire would spread to their own thrones. Inside France, fear and ambition walked together. For a young officer, this was dangerous. But for Napoleon, danger was opportunity. He had talent, discipline, and a mind built for war. He studied maps like other men read poetry. He understood speed, surprise, artillery, and the weakness of commanders who moved too slowly. While others waited for permission, Napoleon moved. Every victory lifted him higher. Every battle made his name louder. Every enemy underestimated him once, and then never again. Napoleon did not fight like the old generals. They moved slowly. He moved fast. They waited for perfect conditions. He created them. In Italy, he took command of an army that was poorly supplied, tired, and underestimated. Then he turned it into a weapon. He inspired hungry soldiers with promises of glory, victory, and wealth. He attacked before enemies could unite. He divided stronger armies and defeated them piece by piece. Soon, Europe began to understand that this young general was not simply lucky. He was dangerous. His soldiers loved him because he made them feel part of history. His enemies feared him because he appeared where they least expected. His victories were not only military victories, they were messages. A new power had arrived. Victory made Napoleon famous. Fame made him powerful. And power made him unstoppable. In 1799, he helped overthrow the weak French government and became first consul. The revolution had promised liberty, but France was tired of chaos. Many people wanted order, stability, and greatness. Napoleon gave them all three. Then, in 1804, he placed a crown upon his own head and became Emperor of the French. It was a moment filled with symbolism. He was not born royal, yet kings now had to treat him as an equal. He had risen from artillery officer to ruler of France. A man made by revolution had become something dangerously close to what revolution had destroyed. He did not inherit an empire. He crowned himself into one. After becoming emperor, Napoleon began reshaping Europe. He defeated powerful coalitions. He forced old monarchies to kneel. He placed relatives and allies on thrones. His armies marched from Spain to Central Europe, from Italy to Poland. The French eagle flew over cities that once believed themselves untouchable. But Napoleon was not only a conqueror, he also left institutions that outlived his battles. The Napoleonic Code influenced civil law far beyond France, and his government reorganized education, administration, and state power. To his supporters, he was a genius who brought order from revolution. To his enemies, he was a tyrant with a crown. But to Europe, he became a storm. And storms do not ask permission before changing the map. Napoleon's empire grew so quickly that Europe's old powers began to fear not just defeat, but extinction. Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, they might hate each other, but they feared Napoleon more. Again and again, coalitions formed to stop him. Again and again, he broke them. His victories became legends. His enemies signed treaties, lost territories, paid prices, and returned home humiliated. But every victory created a deeper problem. Napoleon could defeat armies. He could not defeat resentment. Across Europe, people began to see French domination as occupation. Kings wanted revenge. Merchants hated blockades. National pride hardened into resistance. The empire looked enormous from outside, but inside, it needed constant war to keep standing, and that meant Napoleon could never truly rest. Spain became one of Napoleon's deepest wounds. What looked like another political move became a brutal war. Spanish resistance, guerrilla fighters, British support under Wellington, and years of violence drained French strength. Napoleon could win great battles, but Spain taught him a cruel lesson. An army can occupy land without conquering hearts. Villages resisted, roads became dangerous, supplies were attacked. French soldiers who expected victory found themselves trapped in a war without clean endings. The Spanish conflict became known as a bleeding wound of Napoleon's empire. While he looked east toward even greater ambitions, the West continued to burn behind him. And every fire he failed to extinguish made the empire weaker. Then came the decision that would change everything. Russia had become a problem for Napoleon's system, especially his attempt to pressure Britain through the continental blockade. In 1812, he gathered an enormous multinational army and crossed into Russian territory. Many expected victory. Why would they not? Napoleon had defeated empires before. He had broken kings, redrawn borders, and entered capitals as a conqueror. To many, Russia looked like one more chapter in the story of his greatness. But Russia was different. The distances were vast, the roads were poor, supplies stretched thin. The Russian armies retreated instead of giving Napoleon the decisive battle he wanted. The deeper he marched, the more the land itself seemed to become his enemy. He entered Russia with an empire behind him. He would return with its bones. Napoleon reached Moscow, but the victory he expected was empty. The city was damaged, abandoned by many, and soon consumed by fire. Instead of receiving surrender and peace, Napoleon found smoke, silence, and ruins. He waited. He believed the Russian emperor might negotiate. He believed the capture of Moscow must mean something, but Russia did not give him the ending he wanted. Every day lost in Moscow became dangerous. Winter approached, supplies weakened, horses died, soldiers grew hungry. The army that had marched with pride began to understand that reaching Moscow was not the same as winning Russia. Napoleon had conquered a city, but he had not conquered the war. And now, the long road home waited like a sentence. The retreat from Russia became one of the greatest disasters in military history. Cold, starvation, exhaustion, disease, and attacks tore through Napoleon's army. Modern research has even used DNA from soldiers' remains near Vilnius to identify pathogens that contributed to the catastrophe, adding more detail to the suffering of the retreat. Men who had marched into Russia as part of the greatest army in Europe now stumbled through snow like ghosts. Uniforms froze, hands blackened, horses collapsed, cannons were abandoned. Friends were left behind because no one had the strength to carry them. Napoleon survived. But survival was not victory. The army that had made him seem invincible was broken in the snow. And when Europe saw that Napoleon could bleed, his enemies began to rise again. Russia did not merely defeat an army, it shattered a myth. After Russia, Napoleon's enemies smelled blood. Prussia rose. Austria returned to war. Britain continued its pressure. Russia pushed west. The coalition against him grew stronger, more confident, and more determined. Napoleon still fought with brilliance. He still moved armies with genius. He still won battles. But the old magic was fading. France was exhausted. Veterans were dead. New recruits were young and inexperienced. The empire's allies became unreliable. The people who had once feared Napoleon now believed he could be beaten. In 1814, enemy forces entered Paris. For Napoleon, this was more than a military defeat. Paris was the heart of his power, the stage of his coronation, the symbol of his empire. And now it belonged to his enemies. The emperor who had entered so many capitals in triumph watched his own capital fall. In 1814, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The man who had crowned himself emperor now had to give up the throne. Imagine that moment, the palaces, the banners, the uniforms, the titles, the victories, the millions of men who had marched because of his ambition, all of it slipping away. He was sent into exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba. He kept the title of emperor there, but it was a miniature shadow of what he had once ruled. Europe thought the story was finished. The great conqueror had been placed safely aside, but Napoleon was not a man built for quiet endings. On Elba, he listened, he waited, and inside him, the empire still breathed. In 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba. The impossible happened. He returned to France with a small force, and soldiers sent to stop him joined him instead. The old magic flashed one last time. Crowds gathered. Veterans wept. France watched the fallen emperor rise again. For a brief moment, it seemed history had reopened the door. This period became known as the 100 Days. But Europe would not allow Napoleon's return to become permanent. The powers that had defeated him before now prepared to destroy him completely. Napoleon needed one final victory, one final battle, one final proof that he was still the man who had bent Europe to his will. That battlefield would be Waterloo, and there the dream would end. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon faced the Allied armies at Waterloo. Rain had soaked the ground. The battlefield was muddy. Time mattered. Every decision mattered. The French army fought fiercely, but the enemy held long enough for Prussian forces to arrive and turn the battle against him. Waterloo became the name of final defeat. Not just a lost battle, a lost world. The emperor's last gamble failed. The man who had survived revolution, risen above generals, crowned himself, ruled Europe, escaped exile, and returned from impossible odds now had nowhere left to go. After Waterloo, he abdicated again on June 22, 1815. Soon after, he surrendered to the British and was sent far away to Saint Helena, an isolated island in the South Atlantic. This time, there would be no escape. Saint Helena was not a kingdom. It was a prison made of ocean. Napoleon arrived there in October 1815. He spent his final years at Longwood, far from the capitals he had conquered, far from the armies that had worshipped him, far from the throne he had built and lost. The man who had once moved Europe with a command now lived under watch, surrounded by cliffs, wind, rain, and memory. He had built an empire from ambition. He had crowned himself above kings. He had changed law, war, politics, and history. But in the end, he could not command time. He could not command fate. He could not command the sea that trapped him. Napoleon died on St. Helena on May 5, 1821, and his story became a warning. The higher a man climbs on ambition alone, the farther he has to fall.